So, we've recently started, you may know, releasing a history of humanism in 100 objects. So needless to say, I couldn't resist making this through the medium of objects as well, although you'll see that I've cheated quite a lot because there are multiple objects on most of the slides, has to be admitted now. But in any case, this is a brief jaunt through a slightly longer history of LGBT humanist activism, which, as Chris said, has ever been rooted in what Duffy referred to as this ethics of compassion, grounded in reason, and of course in love as well. So I'm going to start off with Edward Carpenter's sandals. So Edward Carpenter was born in 1844. He was a socialist, a poet, a writer, and a philosopher who, even though he was once ordained as a curate for the Church of England, left the ministry and ultimately embraced a decidedly alternative lifestyle, of which his sandals were just one representative part. The year before this particular sandal template was created, however, Carpenter had privately circulated a pamphlet which was called Homogenic Love, in which he wrote about his hope for a wise humanity, drawing inspiration from science, which could shed a light on things that might seem unfamiliar to some people and give us a greater understanding of them, and also from love, which could recognise the validity, importantly, of variation in society. The leaning of sexual desire to one of the same sex, he wrote in this pamphlet, is in a vast number of cases quite instinctive and congenital, mentally and physically, and therefore twined in the very roots of individual life and practically ineradicable. To cast a slur upon this kind of love, he argued, would be a most irrational thing to do. In that same pamphlet, he took examples from throughout history, from the ancient world, through Shakespeare, of course, and through lots of other examples of literature. So he's very much a part of that, drawing on that much longer evidence of same-sex love and same-sex attraction all the way through history that Chris mentioned in the beginning of this event. Carpenter himself lived with his partner George Merrill from 1898 until Merrill's death in 1928, and their relationship in part inspired E.M. Forster's novel Maurice. So there they are together in what is just a great image. Many UK figures, including Carpenter, drew inspiration from Europe, where there was a lot more, research going on, and also active efforts to bring about change in the law as well. One such figure was Magnus Hirschfield, whose Scientific Humanitarian Committee had been founded in Germany with the motto, which I'm always scared to say because I'm not a Latin speaker or reader, it has to be said, per scientiam ad justitiam. Okay, Andrew's nodding, which means justice through science, or through knowledge to justice. And among the aims of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee were the abolition of Germany's anti-gay laws, the promotion of public education about homosexuality, and also the encouragement of the LGBT community to take up the struggle for their rights. Under Magnus Hirschfield's leadership, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee gathered over 5,000 signatures from prominent Germans on a petition to overturn what was called paragraph 175, which criminalised homosexual acts between men. And signatories of that petition included Albert Einstein, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Max Brod, who was a close friend of Franz Kafka. Notably for us and for the history of humanist LGBT activism, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee took a rationalist, reformist approach to laws regarding sex and sexuality, which prefigured and then interacted with a British organisation, which was led and populated largely by humanists and free thinkers. So next is a little bit more of a abstract one, perhaps, more light. The The British Society for the Study of Sexual Psychology was originally formed on the 12th of August 1913 as the British Society of Psychiatry, and among its founders were Edward Carpenter, Magnus Hirschfield, and Lawrence Houseman, who was a vice president of the Ethical Union, as Humanists UK then was, along with other activists and thinkers and writers. It became the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology and later the British Sexological Society, but it aimed to advance a particularly radical agenda in the field of sex reform by discussing sex rationally and on the basis of science and not superstition. In 1918, humanist and feminist Stella Brown wrote an article about the BSSSP in the International Journal of Ethics, which had itself been founded by leaders of the international ethical movement, in which she discussed the origins and the efforts of the group, which arose, she said, from the need for unprejudiced and thorough investigation of sexuality. However grudgingly and imperfectly, Brown wrote, light was being at last let into some of the dark places where life still agonised and decayed, and the initiators of the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology felt the need for more light, and particularly in the case of members of the specially privileged and responsible medical, legal and educational professions. The BSSSP held meetings, facilitated discussion, and published on a range of topics relating to sex, sexuality, and law reform. And Houseman later wrote that it had been instrumental in helping to form a new public opinion or a new open-mindedness towards sex. In 1929, members of the BSSSP were active in the World League for Sexual Reform, some of whose key figures you can see on the right here. And the Congress of that organisation was held in London that year. And Dora Russell, one of my personal favourite humanist women, later wrote that there we had passed resolutions on marriage and divorce, sex and censorship, sex education, birth control, abortion, prostitution, and venereal disease, which might serve as the basis for a tolerant and humane society, some of which have even yet not been realised. This was in the 80s. But we had, as Hirschfield urged upon us, broken through the conspiracy of silence. Now, of course, the Wolfenden Committee was established in 1954 to investigate the legality of homosexuality and prostitution in a year when imprisonments under the existing laws governing homosexuality had risen to over 1,000 per year. The Ethical Union, as Humanists UK was then, submitted evidence to the Wolfenden Committee, advocating reform on the basis that the law had no business interfering in private conduct between consenting adults. Ultimately, that is what the committee agreed, concluding that there must remain a realm of private morality and immorality, which is, in brief and crude terms, not the law's business, and recommending decriminalisation. A number of prominent humanists before and after the report's publication pushed for reform and continued to push for reform, which was, it has to be said, fairly slow in coming, even on the recommendations of the committee. The letter seen here on the right, which appeared in the Times, expressed the hope that the government will introduce legislation to give effect to the proposed reform at an early date. And humanist signatories on this letter included A.J. Ayer, Isaiah Berlin, Julian Huxley, Stephen Spender, Bertrand Russell, and Barbara Wootton. And a number of those became active supporters of the campaign for homosexual equality when that came into being as well. This particular book, Live and Let Live, was authored by Eustace Chesser, also a humanist, and as the title suggests, had a Live and Let Live response to the moral of the Wolfenden report. Now to the founding documents, perhaps, of what was initially the Gay Humanist Group. And it was at the CHE conference of 1979 that the Gay Humanist Group was officially launched, although it was the outcome of discussions that had been happening ever since the blasphemy prosecution, which had been brought by Mary Whitehouse against gay news, which Whitehouse had won in 1977, the first prosecution of its kind for 50 years at that stage. Whitehouse had accused a gay humanist lobby of being behind the backlash, a lobby which didn't exist but could, and then did. And in the year of its formation, the Gay Humanist Group's newsletter included a warning about the evangelical Christian charity, the Pilot Trust, and its so-called counselling activities. So very immediately launching into the kinds of campaigns that are still very relevant today. As stated in its constitution, the Gay Humanist Group sought to promote an understanding and awareness of humanism among gay people, to further an understanding and awareness of gay people among humanists, and to protect and promote the rights of gays and humanists. And this was very much seen as a double battle, with both groups frequently accused of or immorality. So it was important that those two allied with each other. And moving swiftly on to some of the other archival evidence for the early work of the Gay Humanist Group. The archive at the Bishopsgate today holds this letter from the MP David Wilshire, who introduced the notorious Section 28 amendment to the Local Government Bill, which sought to prevent the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. In this letter, he seeks to assure Jim Herrick that it isn't bigotry or hostility which motivates him. Nevertheless, Gay Humanist Group members were among those who actively resisted the legislation, which was only finally repealed in England and Wales in 2003. Throughout the 1980s and onwards, LGBT humanists called attention to and campaigned against discrimination in all its forms, including challenging misinformation and hate around AIDS, and protesting Christian counselling by bodies like, as mentioned, the True Freedom Trust and U-Turn Anglia, which was run by a man whose own son had killed himself as a result of being unable to reconcile his sexuality and his faith, or indeed the faith of his father. Next, we come to this great portrait of E.M. Forster, which was given to Conway Hall by what was by then the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association to mark their 10th anniversary and to show gratitude for many years of hosting by Conway Hall. Social events, meetings, fairs and public debates all took place there. And although E.M. Forster was not open about his sexuality during his lifetime, he was actively involved in a range of activities for civil liberties and human rights, as well as being a very prominent voice for humanism. And in that sense, this portrait in Forster himself is a reminder of the wide-ranging efforts of LGBT humanists for the decades before and since the creation of the Gay Humanist Group itself. Moving then, again, another abstract one, the hearth rug. So beyond campaigning and activism, as Chris mentioned, LGBT humanists were also pioneering in their offer of secular ceremonies of all kinds. In the face of the backlash against lesbians and gays from reactionary forces capitalising on the AIDS crisis, GALHA organised, promoted and performed affirmation ceremonies for gay couples. Particularly notable was the 1987 live broadcast of such a ceremony, for which GALHA provided the script, which was broadcast on Network 7, featuring, as George Broadhead described, the first close-up gay smoocher on TV. This script was used again for a mass gay wedding held at London's Hippodrome nightclub, and in many more across the UK. And I've chosen the hearthrug here because it is something that ties together many visions and descriptions of early humanist ceremonies conducted in living rooms and people's homes across the UK. As well as same-sex commitment ceremonies, humanist celebrants led naming and affirmation ceremonies for trans people as well. So in all of these areas, it was humanist celebrants who were, again, as Chris said, at the vanguard of so many of these things. Of course, it would be impossible to resist including this cake from 2004's 25th anniversary celebrations, which includes this unforgettable image of Mary Whitehouse. The group often described themselves as being born of Mary, in a nod to Whitehouse's early influence on their formation, as mentioned before. And it is notable that Whitehouse was a particularly prominent, but not lone voice in her fears about some kind of gay humanist lobby putting pay to all that was good and holy in the world. And as Anthony Gray wrote in a later work of his, and Anthony Gray did also speak for the Gay Humanist Group. In 1980, Valerie Riches of the Responsible Society, as it was called, described a devilish plot involving a tremendously powerful network of some 35 agencies, which included governmental departments, the Health Education Council, family planning agencies, the Communist Party, humanist organisations, and the Sexual Law Reform Society, all of whom, she said, engaged in deliberately promoting teenage promiscuity and sexual irresponsibility. I don't really know what it is, said Mrs. Riches. Communism, humanism, world domination, I don't know, but I do know it's happening, and it's terribly clever. Cakes feature quite nicely, as you can see in this other picture of our first, or LGBT Humanist first president, Maureen Duffy, cutting the cake at the 5th anniversary celebration of the Gay Humanist Group. And Chris mentioned her great talk for the group, her first presidential address, in which she talked about this ethics of compassion. And finally, and I think Andrew will pick up a bit on this after I conclude, I would like to mention, meeting as we are on the eve of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia, that it is important to note that the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Group played an early and an outsized role for a group of their size in organising activities around the commemoration, around Idaho, as it was called then, from its outset. Derek Leonard is a former chair of LGBT Humanists and was UK coordinator for Idaho. And the kind of events that they were putting on, as soon as Idaho was first introduced in 2005, included film screenings, debates, talks, and kiss-ins even. And although the play shown here wasn't produced for Idaho celebrations, it does show the importance of community, of creativity and history and fun, which has also been such a big part of LGBT Humanists throughout its existence. And just to conclude on that, I would like to play a short extract of Derek himself talking about this. He couldn't be here today, but I have spoken to him previously about his involvement with the group. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear this, but he's very softly spoken, so you might need to lean in or turn up. And hopefully one or other of my co-panelists will give me a thumbs up as and when they can hear this. So this is Derek Leonard talking about his time with GALHA.
Another thing to say perhaps is, I did allude to, most of us who have friends in GALHA met at public meetings. As part of our history, an important part of our history, even those outside London who'd come down specially for events. And there's a big network of friends who have that experience now and are in our 60s, 70s, even 80s, and who go on holiday together and go out for nice meals together. And those public meetings are quite an important part of our memory, even of our identity. That's a sort of comradeship of humanism, has some sort of meaning.